of the context, as Nehemiah is a contemporary of the prophet Malachi, since I didn't want to continue on directly in Malachi for the sake of those who can't be here on Wednesday nights. But keeping with the idea, we're going to look, this is Nehemiah chapter 10. And really, we should have probably looked at this before starting the book of Malachi, but better late than never. Chapter 10, verse 28. This is the section covering the obligations of the covenant. Now you say, what covenant? Well, broadly, the Mosaic covenant that Yahweh made with his people, but more specifically, these are the additional obligations, if you will, that the people in Nehemiah's time, the ones whom Malachi is about to be prophesying and preaching to, take on themselves when the covenant is renewed or restored in Jerusalem. So, within the context, the people have went into exile. The Lord has brought them out of exile. They are back in Jerusalem. Nehemiah, as the governor, is setting up order. They've reestablished the temple. They're getting everything together. And one of the things they have to do, as we see throughout the book of Exodus, is a covenant rededication or a covenant renewal. It's not that Yahweh broke his end. It's that the people broke theirs. So, we're going to be looking at this in verse 28 of chapter 10 of the book of Nehemiah. I think if any of you were here for the first and maybe the second lessons in the book of Malachi, these should strike you as, what happened? Because we're going to see that many of the things obligated upon the people, the priests, the Levites, etc., are the very things Malachi is specifically rebuking them for. So we're going to do a little bit of cross-referencing as well. So, I'm going to begin by reading in verse 28, probably through the end of the chapter, just so we can get it on. The rest of the people, now it says that because above it is a long list of names. I'm not reading that portion for everybody's benefit. I do recommend you read it silently in your head and pretend to pronounce them. As it is important to see how the Lord orders his people. These are leaders of the people, either chiefs of the Levites. They are the dignitaries that are signing the document, so to speak. No need to read the names there. So, the rest of the people, who do not get listed in the long, lengthy name list, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. We will not give our daughters to the people of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or on a holy day. And we will forego the crops of the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. We will also take on ourselves the obligation to give yearly a third part of the shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed feasts, the holy things, and the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have likewise cast lots for the wood offering to bring into the house of our God according to our fathers' houses at the times appointed, year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our ground, and the first fruits of every fruit of the tree, year by year, to the house of the Lord. And also to bring to the house of the Lord, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks. Paul's injection. When it says the firstborns of our sons, they are to be redeemed. The firstborns of the livestock are to be offered on the altar. End injection. And to bring the first of our dough and the contributions of every tree, the wine and the oil to the priest, and to the chambers of the house of our God, and to bring to the Levites the tithes from our ground, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our towns where we labor. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites, and when the Levites receive the tithes, the Levites shall bring up the tithe to the tithes of the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. For the people of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring the contribution of grain, wine, and oil to the chambers where the vessels of the sanctuary are, as well as the priests who minister, and the gatekeepers and the singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. Now, that is a fairly weighty monologue for anyone to speak, particularly those who are being exclusively obligated in this case. I'm not sure how many of you have been in the Malachi Sunday school class, so we're going to flip over now, if you would, to the first chapter of Malachi, just to look at some of the key points here after reading what the leaders, the priests, the Levites, and the people have vowed and obligated to do. So, we saw, and I really need like 2 Bibles. Let me grab one so I can go back and forth. Yeah. First time I had to do this compare some things. There we go. Okay. So, the first thing that they are obligating themselves and commanding themselves to do has to do with separation, has to do with purity. Now, pretense for that, when Moses initially instituted the covenant, they were given specific instructions regarding the inhabitants of the land. The first one being, when you enter the land, kill them off. Purge the land of the evil. Okay, the Canaanites in Canaan, all, I think there's 7 or 8 different kingdoms, were some of the most wicked and abominable people on earth at the time. The Lord had absolutely no use to let his people mingle with these wicked, wicked people. Okay, they were to completely and utterly wipe them off the face of the earth. Because he knew that if not, they would cause the people of Israel to sin. They didn't do it. They failed. One of the first of the long list. So now we have, even by this time, now remember they've been taken into captivity, they've now come back. Well, during the whole time they were in captivity for 70 years, it's not like the land just sat there completely vacant. You know, the native tribes that they didn't completely wipe out were like, hey, remember those annoying foreigners that took us over a while back? Yeah, Babylon just carted them off. Why don't we just go move back? So basically they did. So when the exiles return, not only are they having to rebuild, but you've got fairly well established Canaanite culture again throughout the land. So part of the re-obligations here for the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and all who separate themselves, I think it's interesting that that clause is added there, because when you see the original declaration back in Exodus, Moses is very specific about the priests, very specific about the Levites, and then the people are told not to intermarry. But here we actually have so it's an example of a broadening focus with a narrowing perspective. I think that's how you say it. And what I mean by that is, as the redemptive history progresses, the focus gets narrower and clearer. Okay, narrow focus, broader expands. Yeah, there we go. Had it backwards. Okay, so the focus onto Christ is narrowing, but the expanse of the people included is actually expanding out. So it actually forms like an arrow this way and an arrow that way at the same time. It's a cool symbol that I can't do with my hands. So just try to picture it in your head. The point is, by this point already, the exclusivity of some of the holiness, if you will, was already being expanded to the people. Now, part of that is probably the fact that they've just went through the exile and the judgment, and now they're like, yes, let's finally obey. So the priests are broadening okay, you're a holy nation, actually behave like it this time. So we see that Malachi doesn't explicitly deal with this particular thing they do. Nehemiah, though, later on has to rebuke them again because they've already broken their word on it. So the people weren't terribly faithful even then. But let's see. They do finish that first statement there with join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in the law, God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments that the Lord our God and his rules and his statutes. I almost don't like to read it because I know that I can't do it. Much less put myself under an oath for something that, though the heart longs to fulfill, you also know that you're going to fail. Yet we are told to strive for holiness. They were told to strive for holiness. So when we see people in the Old Testament, these people, different times, different places, I think sometimes the temptation to be like, oh, it's those people. It's like what we were talking about earlier. Those distant people, those far-off people. Look how bad they did. They kept sinning. They kept messing up. They kept ruining everything. Well, the reality is the best thing to do is to put us in their shoes, because we would have been those awful people. We would have been there ruining everything and messing everything up. So do keep that in mind. Nonetheless, I do want to show the historical setting for why Malachi doesn't show them much quarter. Because when you get to the prophet Malachi, he's pretty much, this is this, and that is that. Here's what the Lord has to say about it. Get ready. Because they were at the literal end of the line. And Malachi's at the very end. Good job. So, moving on there. We will not give our daughters to the people of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or on a holy day, and we will forego the crops of the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. Now, context there, remember, the people of Israel have returned to Jerusalem. The Persian government has bankrolled the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. But outside of Jerusalem is basically Canaanite pagan villages everywhere. The Jews set up worship in Jerusalem. They bring a whole bunch of non-farmers out of exile back into the city. Guess what? They need food. They need stuff for their offering. The Canaanites say, hey, here's a good idea. Why don't we bring up our stuff and make those exiles buy it from us? Okay, good business sense. And for a while, that's exactly what was happening. They knew that they offered sacrifices on the Sabbath day, so they'd just bring them up in the morning on Saturday. They're like, hey, why don't you buy it from us? Well, for one, that's in strict violation of what Moses said regarding the offerings to be offered to begin with. And we're going to see that in Malachi. That's one of the rebukes, that they're offering sacrifices either purchased from foreigners or taken by blood, taken by force. And on top of that, they're not honoring the Sabbath day. They are intentionally conducting business, but intentionally conducting business to get themselves out of the harder job of doing what they're supposed to be doing on Sabbath day, which is actually taking the time to get the actual sacrifice needed. So, if that makes sense, they're conducting business to get themselves a cheap and easy way out of their obligations on the Sabbath day. So it's a real mess. The thing is, we know this hadn't really stopped because Christ has to purge the temple twice during his ministry for this very thing. This is the very idea and the very context, fast forward, that was going on in the first century Jewish temple then too. Herod had built this great outer court, conveniently called the Court of the Gentiles, because it was literally the religious marketplace, where they could bring all the stuff in and have the first supermarket, basically. But we see what the Lord's response was in regards to the buying and the selling, probably the cheating of the people too. That seems to be wherever selling of religious items and affiliations and artifacts and other fun things, there happens to be gouging and price, just seems to go hand in hand. Where people try to make money off of the Lord's service, they're going to do it in the most heinous way possible. That might be a jab at Catholic idols. Have you ever been in like a marketplace in like a Catholic country where they just like, you can't even walk through there without them, hey, let's buy this, or this rosary bead, or this little crucifix, or a whole other, like, when I was in Costa Rica, and this is a total side note, but I thought about it, because it is applicable. They were selling at one of the marketplaces, authorized by the local cathedral, supposedly parts of the cross. All the way down in Central America, from the cross of Christ. Okay, so we then go into the shop, just because one of my friends was curious, and the guy has an entire trunk full of all these cute little packaged wood slivers labeled Christ's cross. Okay, modern day example, but it sort of gives you the feel of, that should just be like, what are you thinking? But to the mind of someone who isn't actually attuned to what the Lord wants, that's a perfectly okay, normal thing.
There's a mission close to where we stay when we're out west, and they do have holy water there, and it's available, and there's no charge for it. However, they will sell you a bottle for them to put the holy water in, so that you can get it and take it after you visit the mission.
So will Shapley Springs.
Yours. It's probably better for you.
It's a point.
If you want some holy water, all you gotta do is go to the Catholic Church.
That's what I'm saying,
They
the
all
mission,
have-
they don't sell you the water, but they'll sell you the bottle so they can put the water in.
Another modern day example. So that is the idea of what's going on here. Now the people are vowing not to partake in this, religious business stuff. It's actually been an issue because even from the time of David and Solomon, the people were lazy after they got rich in the city, and it was always easier to send your servants out to the marketplace and buy your offering. Well, if you were buying it from a Jewish vendor, and it met the qualifications of unblemished, male, year-old, nothing wrong with it, that was perfectly acceptable. You were allowed to buy the product, the products of the farmers for the offering. That was not the issue. The Lord has that system set up so that the farmers can live. The issue here is that you had the Canaanite people that were repopulating the land, bringing in their messed up, worthless stuff, because remember, all of their good stuff was going to their own temple. Okay? They're then undercutting and selling it for cheaper than the people of God, the few farmers that returned could actually produce legitimate offerings. The people are opting for the cheap one. So not only are they opting for the cheap, foreign, defective sacrifice, but they're not actually buying it from the Jewish farmers, who that's their job, is to grow sheep. So they're actually undercutting their brother as well. So Nehemiah deals with the mistreatment of the poor, because often shepherds were some of the lowest ranking people. Still like that today. So that just gives you the setting there. And we see they're obligating themselves not to do these things. And yet, by Malachi, which is a contemporary, probably 2 to 3 years after this initial dedication to Nehemiah, Nehemiah has to go back on royal duty to the Persian court for a little while. The general scholarly consensus is Malachi is prophesying and ministering to people in Nehemiah's absence. So we're at the very tail end of the chronology of the people of Israel. So let's see here. This is what the Lord says in Malachi. We looked at it in the first lesson. I'm just going to read it again. This is the Lord declaring in response to them, how have they despised your name? Question. By offering polluted food upon my altar. But you say, how have we polluted you? By saying that the Lord's table may be despised. When you offer blind animals in sacrifice, is that not evil? When you offer those that are lame or sick, is that not evil? Present that to your governor. Will he accept you or show you favor, says the Lord of hosts? So we see by this time, just probably a couple years later, after taking this vow, they're already offering and I'm not saying the entirety of the people were doing this. In fact, Malachi is very specific. He's dealing with the priests. We looked at that in the lesson on Malachi, and I think those are all up on wherever they go on the internet, aren't they? Except for the one I recorded on my phone, the first lesson of Malachi. Yeah. So if anybody missed it, you can go get it. What's likely happening there with the priest and Malachi's rebuke to them is the people were bringing in good and healthy animals, and the priests were subbing them out for the cheap ones they bought at the marketplace from the foreigners and selling the good ones back at a higher price. That is the consensus of what likely was happening, given some textual clues as well as Nehemiah's reproach and just some historical notes of what was actually happening. So we get to see this was a fairly abominable circumstance that was brewing up. But continuing with our prep work, we also take on ourselves an obligation to give yearly a third part of the shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed feasts, the holy times, holy things, and the sin offering to make atonement for the people of Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. Now that's again, fairly lofty, admirable obligation to put yourself under. You better do it. Yes, Gigi.
What does it mean by the new moons?
Every new moon, so once a month, they had a special offering to offer on the day of the new moon. Throughout the entirety of the Jewish offering system, there were daily sacrifices, weekly sacrifices for the Sabbath, there were additional sacrifices for every specified holy day, and there were special sacrifices on the new moons. The Jewish structure follows a lunar calendar. So every time you have a new moon, which is the starting of a new month, it's sort of a refreshing, if you will. So part of the reason for the sacrifices on the new moon in particular was a monthly sacrifice, if you will. It would be like if we were saying, and the sacrifices on the first of the month. That is colloquially, I can't even say that word. How they could say it within their saying. They could just simply reference the new moons. We don't really go by a lunar calendar. We're quite removed from it, so it does sound weird, but that is the impetus there. So we see then over in Malachi, I told you we're going to be flipping back and forth, so you don't have to, but
That last one was Nehemiah.
yeah. Now we're back in. Okay, so this is verse 12 in the first chapter of Malachi. This is the Lord speaking again. But you profane it when you say that the Lord's table is polluted, and its fruit, that is, its food, may be despised. But you say, what weariness is this? And you snorted it, says the Lord of hosts. You bring what has been taken by violence, or is lame, or sick, and this you bring as your offering. Shall I accept it from your hand, says the Lord? Cursed be the cheat who has a male in his flock and vows it, yet sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished. So, again, they've obligated themselves to support the Lord's house, to tithe monetarily, to tithe actual amount of grain, an actual amount of oil. You know, you think I'm not just trying to beat any dead horses here, but it's like they actually had a 10% monetary tithe, a 10% grain tithe, a 10% of every single resource that they're bringing in. And they are obligating themselves actually above and beyond even what the Lord had commanded here to do it. So we see in Malachi that it's bad enough when they're not doing what the Lord has required of them, but they're actually violating the will or free will commitments that they've made previously. And the Lord very much dislikes this. You see that with Ananias and Sapphira to a degree in the New Testament. Peter says, while this was still yours, it was all yours. You could have done with it what you will. We know that they sold their property, told the apostles how much they sold it for, presented it, but actually kept a portion back and lied about how much they got for it. They could have just said, here's half of what we got, and been fine. Instead, it's similar, it's not quite the same, but it's the idea here of trying to cheat or make things look better or
Deceit.
backtrack. Yeah, it's a deceitful heart is the issue at hand. Okay, and they had willfully obligated these things to, and I'll read it again, and for all the work of the house of our God. And yet by Malachi's time, the Lord's rebuking them because they're saying, oh, what weariness it is to get up every day to burn that offering, to keep that lamp going, to offer the grain offering, to pour the wine offering out. Now, and we addressed it in the lesson on Malachi, this is the priest speaking. These aren't the laymen. Okay? These are the priests whose entirety and their entire inheritance and their portion is Yahweh and his priesthood. So it was quite obscene for them to even be uttering these things. So, just trying to, yes, Don.
Okay. If I join the church, I'm committed to those things that are expected by the church from me. If I join the church, I should tithe. But, tithing, someday I will. Not today. There's no difference in what you're saying they did and what we do.
Yeah, I mean, the idea there is, first off, we're not to bear false witness. So from the very beginning, Christians are to be upfront and honest. So there's the idea of if your Lord says do this, then you do it. If he says give this, then you give it. And on top of that, if you being free in your Christianity to offer more, which we are, he loves a generous giver, and you willfully obligate yourself to do it above and beyond, then you're still bound to do it. But that doesn't negate what he's required either. And sometimes I think people say, well, I know I've actually dealt with it with some family members of mine. It's like, well, we donate, X amount to this Christian school, or we send it into this ministry here, or, X, Y, Z. But I just don't like that preacher, so I'm not going to give him any money. My response is, well, maybe you should move churches for starters, because if you really don't like the preacher because he's just awful, that's a whole other problem. And then you got some of those people that are in a good church and we're still like, well, I'm still doing this. Well, it's sort of what the Lord says to the Pharisees in the sense of, in a sense, he tells the Pharisees, you tithe mint, mint, or cumin, and I can't even say the other spices. The point is the teeny tiny bits of pieces, but they're neglecting all of the weightier things. Well, in this case, people are elevating what they call the bigger and weightier things, these big, great donations, all of this external, when in reality, they're neglecting the greater things, which is actually the very thing the Lord commands. You see this with King Saul. The Lord told King Saul, to attack this pagan king, to slay the king, to slay the people, to slay all the animals, and to put the entire nation to the sword, because they were abominable in the sight of the Lord. And they were causing the people to sin. Instead, he captures the king, captures the best of the people, and all the best of the animals, and then burns all the rest of it. He then proceeds to set up an offering, which, by the way, the kings of Israel, particularly King Saul, David has a slightly special status as he's also a prophet, so that's a whole other story. But in Saul's case, Samuel was clearly the anointed prophet of Yahweh at the time. Saul is clearly the king. The office of king and the office of prophet are not the same. And Saul takes it upon himself to not only build the altar, to then proceed to sacrifice these abominably gained animals on the altar he wrongfully built, all because Samuel was late. In reality, the Lord delayed Samuel to show the truth behind Saul's heart. So, again, it's the same idea of, and this is the simple rebuke that Samuel gives the king there, the Lord favors obedience over sacrifice. Sometimes in our sinful heart, it's much easier for us to do greater things, more expensive things that we come up with than to do the relatively simple and small things that the Lord commands. And yet it's those faithfulness in the small things that the Lord values more, in fact, values at all, than whatever we dream up. That also can be applied as well to the entirety of the regulative principle of worship, but that's a whole nother lesson.
Like strange fire.
Yes, it's strange fire.
And
So,
strange fire will get you in trouble, get you dead.
yes.
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah.
So that's an interesting story too. We'll look at that next time. We don't actually know what the strange fire was. There's a couple of theories. It doesn't really matter because it was the fire of the Lord that came out and killed them. End of story. So don't do the things the Lord says not to do. And don't do the things that you think He might like when He hasn't commanded them. So that's the double moral there. So, moving on.
Now, going back to, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
oh, what a weariness this is. To me, that sounds, it's like a guy, I heard a guy one time say this years ago before I was a believer, and sticking with tithing. Preaching on tithing, the sermon is appropriate. A second one close to it, that's meddling. You know, that's the kind of attitude here I see. You know, we're hearing too much about this. We've heard enough.
Well, I promise it's not really intentional. It just happens to be there.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that's the way it comes across.
No,
They're coming back and say we've heard enough.
Yeah.
It's the same old story over and over. You tell
Yeah,
us.
and that's really, you know, these are the priests making that comment. Okay, they don't have to go do anything else. The people are bringing in their food, bringing in the grain, bringing in the wine, bringing in the wood, bringing in the animals for them. Okay, they're tithing to them, and then they in turn offer the sacrifices and the tenth of the tithe to Yahweh. Okay, they have no excuse for saying their one obligation is weariness. The Lord has taken care of all these other things. Okay, everybody else in the nation of Israel still has to go plow the field, still has to go outside. I mean, if you just look at particularly the high priest, but even the garments that were made for the regular priests, the sons of Aaron, and subsequently, they are infinitely nicer and far more glorious to wear, both the feel, because they're made of linen and fine cotton, type material, but also their standing, their statue, they're very much honored. The rest of the people are wearing probably goat skin, maybe sheepskin, rough spun, maybe a coarse linen, because flax was pretty popular to make into linen, but you know, browns, greens, maybe a reddish, ruddy color. But what?
They weren't wearing any purple.
They weren't wearing purple, and they definitely weren't wearing blue, because the blue is particularly for the priests.
And it's expensive to make.
It's incredibly expensive, and we no longer know how to make the blue that the Lord commands for them. We know that it was made by crushing up certain shells of a snail that happened to be in the Sinai Peninsula, but we don't know what else they added to it to make it turn blue. So the priestly blue described in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, if ever a Jewish person says, oh yeah, this is the color blue, no, we don't actually know. The only extant shred of blue that they think predates the fall of the Second Temple is a little tiny corner of what was probably one of the shawls over somebody was wearing from probably like 5 or 6 BC, they think. And that wasn't even, and you think that's still like 1,500 years past when Moses is making the garment. So there's a lot of time to lose a recipe, is the point. I know it's a side note, but blue was extremely expensive. And that's the color that the priests, they were wearing white with blue. Yes, sir.
Just for a matter of information, you know, the squid's blood is blue.
Yeah. So, and that's, again, they're probably related, really. Because, squid also make ink. But the point there is greens, browns, ruddy red, probably even yellows. Those are easy colors. But the temple, the tabernacle, and its priests were given very fine clothes. Now, I always thought it was interesting, and I'm elaborating on priests a little bit, I know, but they're wearing white linen.
In the desert.
In the desert, but they're wearing white linen being a butcher. That's what they do. They literally kill animals from sun to sundown, bleeding them out. Maybe it's the Lord's way of showing the cost to the people, that even the one robed in finest linen still has to get bloody to make atonement. Obviously, that the priest's garments were in a way a foreshadowing of some of the ways we see Christ depicted. You know, throughout the Old Testament, when the angel of the Lord is sometimes described, particularly when the second person of the Trinity meets with the elders on the mountain and dines with them, you get white linen, flames of fire of gold. You get sapphire, which is blue. You also see the priest's garment, fine white linen, sashes of blue. They have gold. They've got the 12 stones, the 12 jewels set for each of the tribes of Israel, set in the headset. So the idea there is the description for the priests are supposed to be human reflections of the greater. So they were extremely blessed. Even by this point, yes, they're removed. They've lost the first temple. They've actually, historically, by this point, have probably even lost their priestly bloodline directly. There may still be priests, but it's hard to say if Ezra was the last known confirmed priest. That's the issue that the Jews have today. Even if they rebuilt their temple, which they don't need to because it would be pointless, or found their Ark of the Covenant, which they don't need to because it would be pointless, they don't actually have a single Jewish priest alive. Because the last confirmed bloodline of priests died before Christ's birth. Yes, all the priests in the day of Christ on earth were priests. They think they were from there, but when you check their own records, the last confirmed priest line died after the return from exile. And they're just thinking they have it right. Adds a whole other layer to when the true high priest comes on the scene. There is no actual Levitical priesthood left. There's just imposters. So today, they're 2,000 plus more years removed from having an actual Levitical priest in the line of Aaron. So it wouldn't do them any good to rebuild their temple. It wouldn't do them any good to find the Ark of the Covenant. It wouldn't do any good to offer their red heifer calves, because they don't have a priest to do it. So, it's a total side note. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just pointing out the fact that in their theological perspective, they have a problem that even they don't have an answer for. So, it correlates, I think. Continuing on, verse 34, we're back in Nehemiah, sorry. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people have likewise cast lots for the wood offering to bring into the house of our God, according to the fathers' houses, at times appointed year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. So not only now are we seeing, they weren't just bringing in animals, they weren't just bringing in money, they weren't just bringing grain, wine, or oil, they've also got to go cut wood. And in the initial institution of the people, the priests were exempted from this job. It was the other people who actually lived out in the forests that brought the offering of the wood. There were no trees to cut down in the priestly cities in the Davidic kingdom. The priests didn't have to go out and cut down the wood. That was part of the specialness of their post, if you will. And yet here we see they are willingly obligating themselves. Now, it could be that they didn't have enough people to go get the wood. Probable. But even beyond that, they are making an additional commitment to the Lord, freely of their own obligation here, obligating themselves, and then they proceed to break it. So, it again just shows the background there for Malachi, how in a very short time, like us, or we like them, depending on how you look at it, go from a religious emotional high, albeit legitimate, because often legitimate religious highs are emotional. In fact, if they're not, you almost do have to question the validity, because we're emotional people serving an emotional God, albeit real experiences come with emotions. They're not exclusively emotion. They're most certainly not exclusively emotion, but they're not devoid of it either. You look at every time somebody encounters the Lord, something happens. They either break out into prophetic song that they don't even know what they're saying, like the prophets dancing through the streets, or I'm trying to think of other illustrations. They're like Isaiah and they're undone, or they're Saul of Tarsus on the road, stricken blind, Lord, it elicits a response. So we see they're going from a legitimate dedication. They are legitimately pledging themselves and re-sanctifying the temple. And then we see them a few years later, give or take, in a spot worse off because they've made these additional obligations. So it actually should serve as a cautionary note that the Lord loves a cheerful giver, but He hates someone who goes back on His word more. Do you see what I'm saying? To just give cheerfully out of the freeness of what you've got is great. But to say you're going to give it because it's great and, I'm going to give this great amount, and then you don't, is far worse than if you'd never given any at all and kept your mouth shut. So, to see there, just trying to extrapolate some lessons for us, because ultimately, people are still people. Yes.
I just was thinking, it comes to mind, if at the point where they were moved by the Lord and they had this experience where they felt that it was obvious to them that they need to rededicate themselves in this manner. It sounds like what you're referring to is they sort of lost the fire. They lost the inspiration that they once had. And I think that also goes in parallel with, where it says in Scripture that the Lord is not pleased with sacrifice. He wants actions. In other words, don't say what you're going to do. I don't want to hear a bunch of words. Just do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we see either just do it and be pleasing, keep your mouth shut and don't do it, or if that doesn't happen, you get the response as the Lord gives them in Malachi of just shut the doors, stay away, don't even come in the temple. And we're going to look at that just so. Verse 35, picking up more of their obligations. We obligate ourselves to bring in the first fruits of our ground. That'd be the grain, the grain, if you will. The first fruits of the fruit of every tree, year by year, to the house of the Lord. And also to bring to the house of our Lord, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons, again, to redeem the firstborn, and of our cattle, to have them sacrificed, as it is written in the law. And of the firstborn of our herds and of our flocks, and to bring the first of our dough, and our contributions, and the fruit of every tree, the wine and the oil to the priests, to the chambers of the house of our God, and to bring to the Levites the tithes from our ground. So, they're again going, yes, the Lord commanded them to do these things, but some of the details here, they're actually expanding from what Moses initially commanded them. They're amping it up, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes that's not good. I do have to wonder to what degree are they being legitimate? They're moved and feel convicted to do it? Or are they recording that they're standing in front of everybody and they're like, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this? We don't know. The text doesn't give us a clear, because it ends, the narrative ends there, and, with them saying, we will not neglect the house of our God. Well, obviously they do, because Malachi gives them a pretty stern rebuke that the Lord is so displeased with them, He's kicking them out. Not even to start the fire. Don't even light a fire on the altar. So, we see that they're pledging to do all of this. The Lord later says, you know, why are you bringing that which is lame, that which is sick, that which is taken by violence? Well, if you went out and took it by violence, or you bought it from somebody who stole it from somebody else, that's most certainly not the first fruits of your flock, or your herd, or of your cattle. So you can just sort of see the contrast going on there. He works through talking about the wine for the drink offering, the oil for the lamp, the fruit of every tree, the wine. I just read that. As well as the tithes given to the Levites in the towns. And then in verse 39, finishing up the chapter, for the people of Israel, the sons of Levi, shall bring the contribution of grain, wine, and oil to the chambers where the vessels of the sanctuary are, as well as the priests who minister, and the gatekeepers and the singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. Now, that is the final section of this, and that's where we're actually going to stop. That sort of concludes the prehistory for what's going on in Malachi. And I know it was probably a little tedious, and it wasn't perfectly laid out. But I did want to show some of the background. So when we're working through Malachi, and I'm not sure when we'll pick back up, I'm not quite sure the scheduling, but we will pick back up with chapter 2, and continue, which chapter 2 in Malachi is the Lord's rebuke to the priests. So I figured it might be good to have some precursor there to when the Lord rebukes the priests. Now we know what he promised they're going to do. So now we can see in Malachi chapter 2 when we get there all of the things that they're not doing. So, are there any questions regarding the less than perfectly thought out lesson for tonight?
I don't really have a question, but I know that we've equated a lot of what we're reading about in sacrifices with giving in terms of funds, in terms of the tithes that we are required, offerings that we can give. But I think when we take those vows, we say more than we'll support the church financially. And it may be that there are services that we give, that we
Right.
participate in, that we volunteer for. There are things that you do, whether it's mowing the grass or teaching a Sunday school class or clean, all those things that are needed, the nuts and bolts. And this is not to say everybody should do that, but I think in keeping with what you were sharing, it's worse to say you're going to do it and not do it than to just not do it.
Right.
Because everybody isn't called to teach kids Sunday school class. Everybody isn't gifted to do a nursery.
Well,
everybody can't, do a lot of, quote, the housekeeping, the nuts and bolts and things
Right.
like that. But if you, in a feeling of excitement and emotionalism, or often just legitimate gratitude, you obligate yourself. Once you obligate yourself, the Lord says to obey is better than sacrifice. So that, I think, is that's what Sapphira and Ananias, it looked great that they were going to sell land and give the money, but be honest about it. Just, be honest.
Right.
The lie was worse than that they didn't give as much as they could.
Right, and Peter even says, you could have given all of it, you could have given none of it. It was yours to do with what you want. Before you sold it, after you sold it, it didn't matter. Peter wasn't rebuking them for only giving half, or however what proportion. He was rebuking them because they lied and said, here's all of it. So again, that definitely plays into it. So, and one final note on those different contributions you see there. They weren't all going straight to the temple. Even by this time, the system, you've got the temple in Jerusalem, you've got the high priest and the immediate temple priests living in Jerusalem, but there were still family groups of priests, as well as Levites, living more or less outside the city. They were attempting to repopulate. But a lot of those contributions are actually going to those Levites, those broader range ministry workers. so that they have something to eat while they're running back and forth on errands for the priest. You know, if the priest didn't have time to go plow their field and plant their vines because they were killing animals all day, somebody still had to run the errands. Somebody still had to sweep the temple. I mean, I can't imagine a cleanup from
I thought of that.
I mean, and I've taught one lesson on it. I think the dedication of the temple was Solomon, but the number of animals that were butchered that day, or sorry, that event, because I don't think it's possible to do it in a 24-hour span. I feel like that was one of them really, really, really long parties. You know, there's like, oh, let's kill 10,000 oxen and 25,000 rams. It's like, I've never even seen 25,000 rams. So, yeah, to put it in context, there was a lot of work in the ministry of ancient Israel. And the Levites were the go-doers. Okay? They were effectively fulfilling the role of the diaconate, the deacons, in that translation over, if you will. So, you know, they were the ones attending to it. So, because of that, they also didn't have time to go plant food. Especially this time because their staffing was a little low. So these extra contributions, the first fruit, okay, you can't just live on parched grain and olive oil. I know one person I was talking to was like, well, did the priest just eat the grain offerings and poached meat? I'm like, no, the people brought in fruit, they brought in vegetables, they brought in grain, they brought in wine. So all of this is to, like any people like us today, you don't just want to eat one thing. There's a full broad range, and for health you need a broad range of it. So all of this is coming in to support the full range of the ministry in ancient Israel. It wasn't just like they were piling up a bunch of pomegranates in the temple storeroom. They were, but it was to be used out.